It's now running.
Yes.
We are now up and you can see it on your screen, and I am talking and okay. All right.
Yes, you are live.
Well, and hopefully there'll be some people showing up here soon and watching the video. Uh, you know, my technical guy there. People watching it other than you, Stephen?
Says two watching here at the very least.
Okay. Anyway, so wow, I finally made it to 10,000 subscribers. This channel certainly had a bunch of starts and stops over the years. Um, Started as just a Jesus, interesting film footage I'm finding, and I just want to collect it all together, and thought about turning it into something more serious in the YouTube world, but things kept on getting in the way, and so should give a couple more minutes for more people to show up.
I mean, assuming most people will be either watching through VOD, but there's not rewatching, so
There's okay, all right,
people filter in as they filter in.
um, all right. There's just a few of you watching. Yeah, so it's as I was saying, I started this channel almost 10 years ago because I was discovering all this hidden found footage of film from British Columbia, and I wanted to collect it all together, and I wanted to clean it up. I wanted to actually, put some details to it. I wanted to make it watchable. And some of it, yeah, I succeeded on. Some of it I didn't. But I've always something I had in my back of mind is I want to do my own scripted videos of the history of British Columbia, and I got sort of was going to start do that, and then things got in the way. So, it's I was just about at that point in 2015, and then various things happened in my life. I had to take a break for a couple of years, and then 2017 I was about to start, and then my desktop computer ceased to be able to render videos, so I couldn't do it. So I'd have to go out and buy a new one. By the time I had a new computer, then the pandemic hit, and all things went crazy in my life, and some various health things and that, and I finally this year feel like I can get back to doing this in the way I want to. I should say, taking it to the next stage of what I want to do with this channel, and that's doing scripted videos. This is the Eliza Anderson. Is this is the picture that's on the screen here, and it's one of the SS Beaver tends to be reasonably well known as a ship early on in British Columbia history, but the Eliza Anderson was an important side wheeler during the gold rush in 1858, taking people from Victoria all the way up to Hope, maybe even to Yale when they could make it. Uh, and it has an interesting story. So I've written some of the script, gotten some of the pictures, some of the information about Eliza Anderson. I'm putting that together, and that's one of the stories that I'm working on, and it's one of many different stories that I'm working on. And I was in the spring beginning to start working on this and start to put it together, and I realized that I'd be able to do maybe one video a month if I didn't sort of get myself organized. So I thought I'd put it off and leave it until end of the summer because I knew I was going to have a really busy summer, and so I'm just at the process where I'm going to start doing some of them. So anyway, the Eliza Anderson is one of the many ships that that story should be done. The Beaver. The Beaver is just such a fascinating story. The highest tech ship in the world, the SS Beaver, the Hudson's Bay Company, when commissioned it. Such a big deal that the king showed up for the launch of the Beaver because it was like such cutting edge technology. And did the Europeans get to see it? No. Came to the west coast of North America. The indigenous people here, they got to see steamships in operation long before most Europeans had ever seen one. So, but there's many interesting. There's also the uh, the Princess Line ships. There's interesting BC ferries. There's also the stern wheelers on the lakes in the interior. There's lots of history of ships. The Eliza Anderson is one I'm going to do, and this man. This is Mifflin Gibbs, an early City of Victoria councillor, elected in 1866. Mifflin uh, was born in Pennsylvania and moved to California and was finding California rather um, unpleasant for him and his community of American blacks, and so he came up in 1850s. Hey, thank you, thank you for the comment. Uh, anyway, Mifflin Gibbs came up to British Columbia and he sat down with James Douglas and said, "Look, I've got a community of black people in California that are not happy with the Americans, not happy with slavery, not happy with all that stuff. Can we move up here?" And Douglas said, "Sure." Douglas being partially a black man, which tends to have been forgotten about. But Gibbs came up together with several hundred black people from California in 1857, 1858, and he became one of the important early leaders of the city of Victoria. Helped set up the first military unit in British Columbia, the Pioneer Rifles, which is an all-black unit. They set it up because they weren't allowed to be part of the fire department, which is a volunteer group, and they said no blacks allowed, so they created a military unit. He also then ran in 1866 for Victoria City Council and was elected. And Mifflin Gibbs, together with Amur Cosmos and one or two others, were crucial at the Yale Convention of bringing British Columbia into Canada. So from British Columbia, one of our fathers of Confederation is a black man who then, in 1870, went back to the States, went to Arkansas, ran a bank, became a very important leader in the community there. And eventually, just after 1900, I can't remember the exact year, was appointed as diplomat for the United States to Madagascar, the first black ambassador. When he came back to Victoria to visit in 1915, and it was headline news in the colonies. So he's an interesting man that I want to do some stories about next year. This is the town of Aniaux. Aniaux is on the northern coast of British Columbia, quite north, close to where Stewart is, up where the Nisga'a country is. And it was created as a town in 1911, 1912 for a gold mine they set up there and a smelter and that. And there's still some little bits and pieces left of the town. But this is like one of these towns that got built all at once and then ended up only lasting maybe a generation. And I want to do stories about a number of these towns. There's Aniaux in that part of the world. There's also Kitsault, which still exists. And that was one of the last sort of company towns that was built. It was opened in like 1980. And the mine closed shortly thereafter. But there's also Cassiar, not far much further from there. Down in the southern interior, we had places like Phoenix, which, huge copper deposit. So these towns, there's a whole series of these towns that I want to do the histories of for the history of how this province developed. And there's a lot of these places are forgotten now. And I happen to be a map fanatic. So this is an 1855 map of the Greater Victoria area. It's just one chunk of it. And I realized I didn't choose the chunk I wanted. But my technical help, my son Stephen, who's next to me here, right at the center of the screen there, just under where it says Lake Hill is where you live now. This is in 1855. So
Well doxed, good sir.
it's beautiful, beautiful map. And there's a lot of these beautiful maps of British Columbia. And then I want to go through and show them and show areas of towns through through the history in its maps, because maps show a lot. This is one of the videos that I hope to get done in the next 6 weeks. This is a submarine called CC-1. It's one of the first two submarines of the Canadian Navy that they got in 1914. Except CC-1 and CC-2 at first didn't belong to Canada. They belonged to British Columbia. British Columbia had a navy for about 3 days. And it's a fascinating story. World War I was just starting. And in Seattle, the shipyard there had built two submarines for the Chilean government. And the Chilean government defaulted on it. And the shipyard owner said, "Damn, what am I going to do with these submarines? Who the hell's going to..." He thought the British will want them. They need to defend the coast from German raiders. So he quickly hopped his ship, came up to Victoria, showed up at the Union Club, and was talking it up around the Union Club saying, "Hey, think any of you guys might want to buy some submarines that have just been built before the American Neutrality Act comes into place? Well, the Premier happened to hear about this, and Premier Richard McBride zipped back into the legislature. And I'm gonna actually go to the legislature and film the spot where he would have gone. He went into the vaults where the province kept its money, filled up some bags with money, found a couple of ship captains, basically said to him, okay, you've got to get down to Seattle today on a boat. Here's some bags of money to give to the shipyard. And then you're going to have to sail these submarines without lights on back to British Columbia because the Neutrality Act's going to get passed today. So they went down there, they picked up those submarines, and without lights, sailed them back up to British Columbia at night, showed up in Victoria with these submarines, and McBride phones up Ottawa and says, hey, I bought 2 submarines for you. What do you think? And Ottawa says, what? You bought us submarines? Why? Because you got to defend the coast. We didn't want these submarines. So it took several days haggling, and eventually the Canadian government did buy them. Turns out they weren't particularly good submarines, but it's a fascinating. There's lots of good visuals I'm going to put together for this story on that.
2 subs is pretty good. But what about 10,000?
What's that?
2 subs is pretty good. But what about 10,000 subs?
10,000 subs? Well, hey, getting to 10,000 subs, I mean, it took a while. Now it's going to take, and I'm happy to, and suddenly the channel's blowing up and I'm getting a lot of subs. One of the other things I want to do in the future is I want to go to small town museums in British Columbia and talk to the directors of them and tour them and see them, because most towns have interesting small little museums. One of the best is the Cumberland Museum. And the Cumberland Museum, whoops, sorry, I didn't have that picture of the Cumberland Museum. There's another picture I have here somewhere. It'll come up later on. I didn't order these well enough. But anyway, so there's I think these small town museums, more people need to know more about them. With 10,000 subscriptions, I am thrilled. It's a milestone, and I'm thrilled to be at it. And it sort of really puts the fire under my butt to actually start getting some of these videos done. I've got the scripts done. Now I've got to get the pictures and the imagery done, and I got to put the videos together. That's all going well. And thank you for the great comments. And hey, one of the reasons I'm also doing this live stream is I'm also looking at, what do you think I should do as stories? What are the stories that you think what are the stories that you want to hear? I mean, I have many, but I want to do stories that people want to hear. This province, people don't know the stories of what happened. This is between Headley and Princeton in the late 1960s. I can't remember the exact year right now. It might be early 70s. And what's happened here is a law enforcement agency is stopped the cars and is searching all the cars leaving the Okanagan. And why are they doing this? Because from the late 1940s till 1974, it was a crime to take fruit out of the Okanagan. You're allowed to buy a certain small amount of fruit, but taking fruit from the Okanagan to the coast or to the north or to Alberta, that was a crime. So they had the fruit police. British Columbia had a police force specifically set up to check people to make sure they weren't smuggling fruit from the Okanagan to the coast to sell it to people. And they would end up stopping the cars and searching all of them. And as a little kid, I can remember my parents would leave the Okanagan at odd hours. Like they'd leave like at before the crack of dawn. I never quite understood it. I'm realizing now we're driving with the station wagon way too full of fruit, way beyond what we're allowed to take. But yeah, it's one of these stories we don't know. These stories, they just are, people don't know the stories of our province. And that's something we have not done a lot of in this province, is learn about who matters in this province, about what matters in this province. Our stories are interesting, our history is interesting, but our schools don't teach them. They didn't teach it when I was a little kid, they didn't teach it, and it does not get taught in the schools well enough. And the woman here, this is one of the most important political figures of BC history. This is a woman, if she had lived 20, 30 years later, if she'd been born a little bit later, she would have been a premier, but she wasn't. This is Nancy Hodges. Nancy Hodges was elected as an MLA in 1941 and served until 1953. She was the first female speaker of a legislative assembly parliamentary body anywhere when she became Speaker of the House in, I believe it was 1951. But she was actually much, much more. That's the thing that she's known for. But she was also a very important crusading newspaper editor. Sort of, if those of you who know Lilowit's Ma Murray, an actually useful Ma Murray. Um, she was very much. She pushed for many, many important issues, and was tried to change things. And when she was an MLA, one of the things she did as an MLA was she realized that Emily Carr was an important artist, and because she was a woman, she was being ignored. So she got one of the conservative MLAs, Tilly Ralston, and two of the CCF female MLAs, and they got together and they said, "Look, the province should start buying and collecting the works of Emily Carr because she is an important artist, and that we should keep and that we should have her works." And one of the male MLAs said, "Why? She's a woman. Women aren't artists." She also, in 1945, on her own dime, decided she'd go to San Francisco for the founding of the UN. She'd said this is an important organization, and she wanted to be there for the founding of the United Nations in 1945, and went down there. But we don't know about this woman. We don't hear about this woman. She's also the last senator to come from Vancouver Island. She was a senator for 10 years at the end of her life, but we don't know about her. And that's a shame. She never ended up being a cabinet minister because, if I remember the story correctly, is she said, "I don't want to be a cabinet minister. I want to speak my voice, and if I'm in cabinet, I have to, toe the government line, and maybe I don't want to. I mean, I agree with the government, but I don't. So she chose not to be a cabinet minister on the grounds that she wanted to be able to be her own person. So I want to do. She's one of the ones I want to do a video about in the near future because she's a fascinating woman that we all should know about. She's one of the most important. She's an important political figure, important person in this province we don't know about. And this was the other Cumberland Museum picture. I thought there. Okay. The Cumberland Museum, it's the best small town museum I've seen in this province. You go downstairs and it's like you're in a coal mine. They've set it up really nicely. I know it's a really crappy picture, but so I want to go to Cumberland. The upstairs is a nice setup, but the downstairs is quite well done of a coal mine. That's what Cumberland was known for before. It was known for its hipster beer culture of these days, and mountain biking. It was known for rather radical lefty politics. So it was good stuff. And the museum's a really good one. And I think there is, I can't even, the number of these small museums, there's like 30, 50, 60, I don't know how many. There's so many of them. And I'd like to go and do a series on them. Okay, and this, uh, sorry, I meant to fit kind of big thing. This is Pioneer, British Columbia. And this is the Pioneer Mine. And Pioneer is next door to Braylorn, which is up in the Upper Bridge River Valley. It's right where one of the wildfires is at the moment. And Pioneer, for me, is important because it's when my father came to British Columbia, it's the first place he worked. He worked underground mining for gold in Pioneer and did what he wasn't supposed to do. He actually smuggled some of the gold out. So as a kid, I could always look at these, gold ore pieces that he had, which, as a little kid, it wasn't that impressive. And then I got older, I realized, oh my God, is that high quality? But Pioneer and Braylorn was such an amazing, interesting gold mining camp. And because I have the personal connection, I want to do the story on that one. So it's once again one of these stories of one of these towns, one of the resource industries of this province. And these stories, we don't know them. The Okanagan. The Okanagan, um, initially, everything was based around the sternwheelers and the lake. There was no roads, there was no railways. There never was a railway going from the South Okanagan to North Okanagan. So everything, the whole Okanagan was based around the landings, and the various different spots in the Okanagan were called landing. And you had yeah, I can't remember how many ships, but I want to do some stories about these ships. And I'm just going through the pictures, but some of the other, I've got pages of ideas, and I'm looking for more ideas. I'm always looking for more ideas, and I mean, I'm sure I'll get through them in the next, decade, maybe sooner. There's many of them, but one of them I want to do is I work right behind the legislature, and I go to the legislature to go to the library there. It's a beautiful spot. But I'll occasionally walk out past this gallery of all the people from British Columbia who won the Victoria Cross. And I want to do a series about each one of the people from British Columbia who won a Victoria Cross. And I can't remember the exact number right now, but that's another one of these series I want to do. I also want to start doing interviews with people who were there at things, or with historians, or with authors. And these are stories that, once again, we need to tell. We need to have people talk about, the historians talk about the research, and authors talk about their books. These stories need to be told. And that's really where I want to go with this channel, is going from the found footage, old film, that sort of thing, to telling the stories of the province. And this is the last hockey team from British Columbia to win the Stanley Cup, the Cougars. 1925, the Victoria Cougars won the Stanley Cup. So since then, no team from BC has managed to win the Stanley Cup. So hopefully the Cougars will come back to life, be an NHL team, and win the Stanley Cup again. Okay, yes, I know I'm dreaming. I'm dreaming, but yeah, I want to talk about some of the sports history of this province. There's some really interesting bits of sports history in this province. The first artificial ice rink was in Denman Street in Vancouver. There was an artificial ice arena in Oak Bay, which now you couldn't even tell it was there, and that's where the Cougars played. And yeah, a number of times until 1925, teams from either Vancouver or Victoria won the Stanley Cup. And the NHL certainly doesn't acknowledge that the NHL wasn't the most important, the only hockey league. There was another one that was just as important on the West Coast. And I think that's about all the pictures that I had ready. So I'm going to be doing some polls and that, but I'm really looking for, if any of you in there want to put in some comments. Uh, what is it that you would like to see a story of? What sort of stories might be of interest to you? And that's one of the things I was hoping to get out of this evening. I'm not going to do this live stream terribly long. All my plans for it were sort of screwed up this week when I set up this live stream. This week, I work for the Ministry of Agriculture, and I'm one of the several weeks a year. I'm one of the emergency management weekly responders, and this week happened to be my week that I was on response. And Wednesday night when I set up this live stream, everything looked okay, and yeah, then Thursday morning showed up, and all hell started breaking loose. So I ended up working all day yesterday and most of today. So my plans to do my organization um, for this all came to a abrupt halt. Yes, yes, Catherine, the indigenous stories, and that's one that I'm trying to figure out how best one can tell the indigenous stories and be respectful of the First Nations. And as you know, I mean, there's a lot of friends of mine that I've heard a lot of the stories over the years. And I do have a list of some elders and some chiefs and that I want to sit down and talk to. Um, I want to talk a bit about one of the stories I want to tell is about the canoes. The canoes that they use on the West Coast here. Shockingly, oh my God, the amount of they could carry, the speed they could go at. Um, I love the fact that the Haida, when they saw the first European ships show up and they had sails, the Haida sort of looked at them and went, "Sails! Damn it! Of course we should have had sails." and immediately built sails onto their canoes. And the Haido canoes, I mean, they could sail on rough open oceans and go up and down the coast. These were robust, strong, large, for all intents and purposes, ships. They're impressive, really impressive. What they I got from an author of a book. I got a, a book all about them, and oh my God, the stories in there they're fascinating. And one of the stories that I want to do is about the development of the Fort Victoria, but at the same time, the Songhees community across the other way. The Songhees didn't originally live in the Inner Harbor, but when the fort was set up, the Songhees realized this was a good place to be to control the indigenous side of the trade with the fort. And the geography of the Inner Harbor, of course, the Hudson's Bay Company fort was set up because a European ship could come right up against the shore and moor there. The Songhees were on the other side with nice beaches where you could pull the ships up. It was, it makes a lot of sense when you look at it, and it was a symbiotic relationship between the indigenous people and the Hudson's Bay Company in the early years. Later on, that doesn't isn't that anymore. One of the other stories I want to tell, indigenous stories that I think is a really important one. Um, the worst natural disaster in Canadian history, where people died, happened in the 1780s in British Columbia when a volcano erupted and covered a whole town. Um, the exact number of people that died is not certain, but somewhere around like 2,000 people were killed by a volcanic eruption. And that was in the Nisga'a lands. And because it's indigenous people, because it was indigenous people before the English were in these parts, somehow it doesn't count as part of Canadian history as being the worst natural disaster in Canadian history. And I think that's wrong. I think that we need to talk about the fact that a volcano wiped out a town. And it was a town. It wasn't a village. And village I think is used very often pejoratively about with First Nations. Like when you got several thousand people, that's a town, especially in the 1780s. Um, and that's another one of these stories. Sounds like I have a lot of really good. Oh, my current vote would be for the Sternwheelers of Aran Okanagan Lakes. Yeah, and there's also Kootenay Lake. And it's and Shuswap Lake. There's like the whole interior. There's a whole pile of them out there. And I would love. And yes, I'm gonna do a bunch of those. Uh, in the small towns it used to be. Um, how they were settled, stories. Yeah, it's the, it's, I find it fascinating how some of these towns, early towns, came into being and why they existed and why they disappeared so quickly. And I had to go to Calgary for a wedding in July, and I drove back via the Kootenays. And in the Boundary Country, I had breakfast in Greenwood. And Greenwood is a town of like, a few hundred people. Well, actually, it's a city. It's officially a city. And you can see that it had its pretensions to be a big city when you have these brick-built, three-story tall buildings lining a main street, and going, yeah, they thought this was going somewhere, and it didn't. There's interesting stories related to that. And yeah, there's these stories of all these towns, and um, I have a list of like, yeah, a long list of these places that were and really that aren't anymore, or are not much anymore. Like places like Colmont, near Princeton, which was a much bigger community at one point, and there's only tiny remnants of it left. So there's we don't tell the stories of what happened in this space. We don't talk about the stories of the indigenous history, which is shockingly longer than most people know, and I don't know it well enough. Um, I want to be able to tell some of it, but it's a very very long history. But even just the last 200 years, we don't talk about the stories of this place. We don't talk about, like 1945, the zombie revolt. Um, they Canada in World War II barely drafted people, and when they did, they weren't supposed to be sent overseas. Then they said they were going to send them overseas. So in parts of British Columbia in 1945, and they were called zombies. These people were drafted and didn't want to be drafted, revolted, and I think it was Terrace or Prince Rupert. There was a revolt, and they actually basically said, "Yeah, no, we're not going to the war in Japan." We also had a mutiny on the Royal Canadian Navy in 1947 that happened in these parts. So there's these stories that we don't know about. We don't know the political history of this province. Like everybody talks about Tommy Douglas and the NDP creating socialized healthcare, but ignores the fact that the coalition government in British Columbia, led by the Liberals, in 1950 created the first process of government funded hospitals in Canada where you could go to a hospital without having to worry about being bankrupt because of it. Um, we don't we don't know about that. We don't we don't know that. Like another story is the primary language of what is now British Columbia that was spoken by the most people in about 1860 was Chinook. It was the trading language that was used by the indigenous people, by the Chinese, by the Kanakas, the people from Hawaii, the Hudson's Bay Company. Where a lot of them were francophones or Scots. Everybody spoke Chinook, and that was the language that unified the place. And that's not a story we talk about much. We don't talk about some of the Hudson's Bay Company, how across the prairies it was very much a very different relationship between the Hudson's Bay Company and the indigenous people. But they came to British Columbia, especially in the southern interior. The Hudson's Bay Company showed up, and the indigenous people said yes, and so. And the Hudson's Bay Company effectively just joined existing, for lack of a better word, trading fairs. There's annual gatherings of people to trade goods in places like the Fountain Valley and the Hachlik community, where people would come from the foothills of the Rockies, from the North Coast, from all over to come and trade there. And the Hudson's Bay Company just joined with that. The relationship of the indigenous people in the Hudson Bay Company in was it in 1840 was a community I worked a lot with, Squilach, in Pavilion, BC. They basically, they would, sell to the Hudson's Bay Company the food that they needed to survive, which was dried salmon. And some years they would sort of say, "Yeah, we're not interested in trading this year." The Hudson's Bay Company had to come up with things, and the one year they sold them smallpox vaccine, and they survived, and the neighboring communities up the Fraser from them didn't. Um, they also got a lot of you know uh, useful utensils in the form of cast iron pots and pans and guns and things like that from the Hudson Bay Company, because for them it was like, we have this fish we can sell it to, but we don't have to. You need to give us something. So the relationship was much different than it's portrayed elsewhere, and then how it was elsewhere. So anyway, it's oh yes, and Falls. Ocean Falls, yes, that's another place that maybe call for a road trip there and go and see it and do a video about it. Maybe summer of 24, summer 25, go and do Ocean Falls and see what's still left and what was part of the town, and maybe talk to somebody who, say, grew up there and remembers time living in Ocean Falls back in, say, the late 60s. That would probably be an interesting one. Um, but anyway, I'm happy I've reached the 10,000 subscribers. I'm happy that my life is now allowing me to start working on all these videos. The scripting process and the storyboarding process takes a lot more work than I thought it would. I've got about 7 or 8 of them partially started, um, and I'm going to have to start going out. I'm having to gather imagery or do some video footage of some stuff, and I'm hoping to, within the next few weeks, have the first one come out. And then hopefully, initially, once every 2 weeks, interspaced with the other 2 weeks, more found footage. That's where I'm thinking is the pattern I'll be going with. Eventually, I might do a museum tour by going to one of the smaller museums somewhere in the region, say Souk or maybe the one in Chinatown. Started that as a museum series. So I'm hoping to, not too distant future, be doing 1 to 2 videos a week, assuming that I can hold that level of production up. Now, and one of my problems is that I need to really buy myself a much more decent desktop computer system for video editing. I mean, the computer I use right now is kindly provided to me by the people of British Columbia as part of my work for the Minister of Agriculture. But I really need a much better one with to do video editing. And so right now I can put things together, but to do what I really want to do with some of these stories, it's not going to be good enough. And so initially there'll be simpler videos with not a lot of too much difficulty. And yeah, the stories, there's lots of them. There's lots out there. And that's what I want to tell. And that's what I want to have be one of the focuses of my life is telling the stories of British Columbia. Because they're fascinating, they're interesting, they're surprising, and we should know them because we live here. And that's a problem is when we live here and we don't know the place that we live in. We can never, I mean, as in people know me, so I always talked about the problem of being English speaking people living in a landscape where the language cannot describe the landscape. English is a language that has 100 words for rain or equivalent, but only a single word for snow. It's a language that has so many different words for a hill, but only one word for a mountain. It can't describe mountains. It can describe green. But it can't describe the brown colors of the interior. Can't describe lakes. A lake is a lake. There's no variations. It can talk about ponds and smaller ones. It can talk about little creeks and brooks and all the small ones, but not like English. There is no such thing as a river in England or Scotland or anywhere in Great Britain and Ireland that is like the Fraser or the Skeena. The landscape here does not suit the English language. So we start with, as English speakers, not being able to talk about our landscape well because our language doesn't allow it. And then we don't learn the stories in school. And the thing is, in British Columbia, I can't remember the exact census data, but a significant, like, believe more than half the population did not go to school in this province. So they learned nothing about the history of this province. Not that the school system teaches it. And having spoken with teachers about it, yeah, there aren't a lot of resources. And I know some of the videos that I have up are used in schools. And this is what I want people to be excited about what happened here, why it happened here. And that's what I think I can do. I find these stories fascinating and I want to tell them. That's where I'm going. So that is John Horgan was born in Ocean Falls. I didn't know that. Maybe I'll go talk to John about it. Have him. The Duke Boars. Yes, yes, the Dukes. Yeah, I just was in Castlegar and went to the Doukhobor Heritage Village there with my youngest son um, in July, and I hadn't been there since I was a kid, like maybe 13, 14, back in the 70s in Castlegar. But yeah, it's an important part of BC's history. There's many different immigrant groups um, that are an important part of this history of this province. There's also and something I do at work is at before meetings, instead of doing the land acknowledgements, I try and give a 2 to 3 minute understanding of the indigenous people of First Nations communities, because most people in this province have no idea of what our First Nations communities are like, what the cultures are like, what the politics are like, what the history is like. And I I had the great fortune of, for about 25 years, working very closely with a lot of First Nation communities, especially in the southern interior of British Columbia, and just seeing the incredible difference between the different communities and the different histories and that, and then seeing the difference in the coast. And we don't know, we just sort of talk about them as Indigenous people, First Nations, and it's like, no, it's much more nuanced. It's much more. It's not more nuanced. It's a much richer, deeper history, and that's one we need to talk. I'm babbling on. I think I have reached the end of what I have to say. Um, I hope to have, yeah, I'm hoping to have a found footage video up this week, and I hope to have, if I can pull it off, the CC1, CC2 video within the next 10, 12 days, and then the Nancy Hodges one after that. Those are sort of they're important ones to me. The CC1, CC2 submarine one, just because a, it's just such a silly story. Um, and just it just sort of sounds like it was made for a TV movie, sort of thing. It's like, maybe it'll be a Netflix series sort of thing. Should probably be a really good Netflix thing. Maybe actually have this region from Netflix as opposed to being everywhere else in the world. Actually, be this region. Anyway, it's yeah, a 90-minute movie. Yeah, it could be that. But Nancy Hodges, I think people need to know who Nancy Hodges is. People really need to know who Nancy Hodges is, and that's, I think, a shame that we don't know her. We also need to know that Duff Patullo, he of the Patullo Bridge, he was an imperialist, and he in 1937 tried to annex the Yukon, feeling that, oh, the feds don't need, Yukon's a big pain in the ass, we just want to take them over. So he tried to annex the Yukon, but apparently the Catholic schools in the Yukon were the ones who stopped it. And of course, Axel Wennergren, this Swedish Nazi Electrolux, incredibly rich man, came to British Columbia in the mid-50s and danced grandiose plan ideas in front of W.A.C. Benny, who salivated at the idea of all this Swedish money coming here to build this huge railway up to the Yukon, of damming up the whole Rocky Mountain Trench to produce, insane amounts of power and more and more and more. Yeah, it was like, it felt like it was a true con job. And that it's a great story. I don't have enough details to do that story yet, but it sounds good, and it's one I want to do. And the other story is like how the Titanic really, really, the sinking of the Titanic destroyed Prince Rupert. And that's the story of Charles Hayes. And Charles Hayes, he worked for the Canadian National, and he had gone to London to get financing to build a competing port in Prince Rupert to compete with Vancouver, on the grounds that it's closer to Asia and a shorter trip from the prairies to export a lot more of the wheat and the goods. And he was coming back on the Titanic with all the funding in place to build a large port in Prince Rupert. And he died, and all the details and everything got lost. And in the whole process, the development of Prince Rupert then got lost. World War I came around, everything happened. And so Prince Rupert, in many ways, is as a community that suffered the most from the Titanic. As opposed to being a city of, say, 1 million people today, it's remained a town of 20,000 and being a small port. So the Titanic had huge impacts on British Columbia. Anyway, I partnerships with Hello BC, not entirely interesting idea. I mean, I'm probably going to try and see if I can work with some of the museums first. And that and if people want to talk, and if I can, and people want to partner with me, work with me, I'm happy to work with other people. We'll see what can happen. Anyway, it's now closing in on 7:45. I did a whole bunch of hours working on wildfires today, and I'm sort of a bit punch drunk and tired. So this is not going quite the way that I meant it to, because it was a very tiring day and tiring weekend and tiring, yeah, last 4 days because of the wildfires. Um, I think I will call it at that. And thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. And there's going to be a lot more interesting videos. Thank you very, very much, everybody who's subscribed. Thank you, everybody who's giving comments. Thank you, everybody who will give me ideas, has given me ideas. I'm always interested in more. So thank you, and good night.